So we will allow for, an awkward minute of allowing folks in. So this is the fun part where we just stare blankly at each other. As folks trickle in, I'll start peppering in the chat for you folks tuning in. Hello from Brooklyn,
North Carolina.
North Carolina.
And
Manhattan.
Queens, right? Oh, Manhattan. You're at
I'm
work?
actually still at work right now. Yeah,
Oh, no.
just like working from home. It's easier to be here than it is for the little ones to be running around. That's for sure.
That
Fair.
is fair. So for folks at home, as we'll allow another bit for folks to come on in. You can see in the chat, you can read more about the event tonight, as well as get a coupon, and we'll get started in just a moment. If you hear any little munching in the background, that's my dog. Like, the weird sounds of doing things on Zoom, right?
Mm-hmm.
It might make an appearance later in the evening.
Yeah, I was going to say, we learned a lot about that during the pandemic.
Exactly. Oh yeah, it's really, you'd think after 3 years of doing this, you'd have seen everything, and there's still things to be seen.
Yes.
So, well, I think that makes for an appropriate segue. So, good evening, and welcome to tonight's live online author event with Greenlight Bookstore. I'm Kay from Greenlight, and we are thrilled to host tonight's event with Michelle Fishburne presenting her new book, Who We Are Now: Stories of What Americans Lost and Found During the COVID-19 Pandemic. She will be talking with Chris Belair, so you're in for an excellent time. Before we start, I just want to say a huge thanks to Michelle, to Chris, and the team at University of North Carolina Press for making this happen, and to all of you for showing up. We're grateful for your support and for the chance to make space for conversation and connection. Now, just a couple of quick housekeeping things. In our Zoom webinar tonight, you can see and hear the speakers, but they can't see or hear you. They can see that you're here though, and there are a couple of different ways that you can interact with the authors and with each other throughout tonight's event, which we highly encourage. The first is the chat, which you can find by clicking on the icon that looks like one speech balloon. You're welcome to post your comments and thoughts in the chat. It's a great way to show your appreciation for the author and interact with fellow attendees. If you have a specific question you'd like to have answered by the author, please post that question in the Q&A module. You can find it by clicking on the icon that looks like two speech balloons. We'll be pulling questions only from the Q&A to be answered in the later part of the program, and we may only have time for a select few questions on specific topics. And importantly, tonight's featured book, Who We Are Now, is available for sale from Greenlight Bookstore. As thanks for attending tonight's event, as I mentioned earlier in the chat, we are offering 10% off the featured book. Enter coupon code GreenlightEvents10 into the coupon discount section at checkout online for 10% off. Our interviewer tonight is Chris Belair. Chris is the monologue writer for The Tonight Show starring Jimmy Fallon, and he has an unusual pandemic story that you will want to hear. His biggest challenge was how to come up with really great jokes while working for months on end in his bedroom turned office and trying to keep his kids entertained at the same time. He'll be speaking with our featured author, Michelle Fishburne. Michelle is a full-time digital nomad, splitting her time between her 2006 motorhome, Airbnbs, and the occasional house-sitting gig. Michelle Fishburne did the unthinkable during the early days of the COVID-19 pandemic. She motorhomed 12,000 miles all over the United States and sat down with hundreds of people face to face. Everyone's story is different. Some, like Fishburne, lost their jobs. Others lost family, friends, and even their own health and well-being. And yet, among the difficulties, many found something that had eluded them before the pandemic. In Who We Are Now, Fishburne lets us hear people's stories as if we were there in real time at the beginning of COVID-19, when employment was uncertain, schools were online, and American life more unpredictable than ever before. We'll be starting off with a reading, and then Michelle and Chris will be in conversation with all of you. So please take it away, Michelle and Chris.
Thank you all for coming, and thank you to Greenlight Bookstores for hosting us. We're very excited to be here. And I say we because Chris is definitely a part of this. And in fact, the reading that you're going to hear is going to be Chris's story. So just to recap, this book, Who We Are Now, Stories of What Americans Lost and Found During the COVID Pandemic, and this is what it looks like, has 100 stories in it of people from all over the country. And a lot of the people, the majority of the people I met as I sort of tumbled my way through the country in this motorhome. Yes, that's my bed and my bathroom, my kitchen. You got the whole thing right here. And some of the stories, though, I did via Zoom because I was looking for a particular kind of story or a particular part of the country. And so that is how I met Chris. And Chris and I Zoomed. And he told me his story of what it's like to be a monologue writer for a late night TV show in the middle of the pandemic during lockdown. And so we'll start with Chris's reading. Thank you, Chris, for joining us tonight. Really appreciate it. I know that you were actually still at work in Manhattan. So we appreciate you staying late and doing this. And I'll turn it over to you.
Well, thank you so much. Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming to tonight. This is an honor for me to just be reading my story, one of several hundred that Michelle, people across the country that Michelle interviewed. And, just reading these stories, I'm just amazed by, her travels and the vast amount of experiences people had. So I'll just read mine to get things started. Jimmy's last in-studio show was Thursday, March 12th, without an audience. That weekend, Jimmy told us he was going to do the show from home. I'm going to work from home like everyone else, he said. And we're all like, awesome, yes, we're doing this. And then in the next breath, it was like, wait, how are we going to do this? But all the credit to Jimmy, he set up a tripod, made a TV show, and basically shot from his house, and it kind of took off from there. As a writer for the show, the first thing I had to figure out was, where do I even work from home? I had a 1-year-old and a 3-year-old in a small New York City apartment in Queens. There's not a lot of space, so I've been working in my bed. I've been in bed ever since. I joke that it's like the grandparents in Willy Wonka. I'm sitting upright with my legs out, and I'm typing away to the sounds of the chaos going on in the next room. My days have been basically working during the day and trying to keep 2 toddlers entertained throughout the week. We tried all sorts of things, from pool parties in the bathtub to obstacle courses around the apartment. It's fun until our downstairs neighbor left a passive-aggressive gift of 2 kids' padded slippers on our doorstep, which is kind of a nice way of saying, keep your kids quiet. Like, do you understand these are 2 toddlers in New York? There's no way we're keeping them quiet. One of the things that was great about Jimmy's at-home shows was watching him interact with his daughters. It was just real, and everyone could relate to the chaos of working at home, with kids jumping over your back and talking to you while you're trying to work. A huge challenge of working from home has been that I miss the camaraderie of the writer's room, where there was always someone you could turn to and ask, is this funny? Can you help me here? Is there a rewrite here? You can bounce ideas off fellow writers. You can bounce off ideas off fellow writers in the Zoom box, but everyone's on mute. Pitching out jokes to silence is extremely uncomfortable. It's probably something like what Jimmy was going through every night. You'd write material for Jimmy, he'd sit down and tell jokes to a tripod. Even though you knew there wouldn't be laughter, there was always a heart-sinking feeling every time there was just dead silence after a joke. Maybe his wife Nancy would chuckle, or maybe the kids wouldn't laugh, and that made it funnier. But seeing those jokes die to silence every night was hard. You just had to tell yourself, maybe someone at home found that funny. We wanted to make people laugh and give them something to look forward to at the end of the night. People were having a hard time, and they wanted to show that we wanted a show that was an escape from what was going on. As a writer, that posed some difficulties. How can you escape from the pandemic when everything going on in the news is about the pandemic? You felt like while you wanted it to be an escape, you also had to talk about what everyone was going through. And I think that's where our team sort of geared towards. What was on everyone's mind at that moment? Whether it was panic buying of hand sanitizer, mass wiping down of groceries, people working over Zoom, we were writing for an entire new world. Another challenge was writing our weekly bit that we call thank you notes. They've always been my favorite part of the show to write for because you can write about anything, and that broadness is exciting, especially for me who writes about the news every day. Observational humor is fun and different. Usually you find inspiration for it when you're just out and about, living your life, taking the train, walking by people. But how do you find inspiration when you're working from home, especially working in bed? When you're just looking around your room for the 100th day? Thank you, blinds. Thank you, ceiling fan. You just kind of lose all that sense of the outside world in a weird way. It's an exciting time now for the show to be in front of a full audience again. When Jimmy walks out there and he says, "I can feel the love," you really, really can feel the love of the audience. He's just so pumped. It's exciting to see him read your material and hear the audience laugh, finally. So that was just one story of several that Michelle collected over her long journey across the country. And I've said I've read this book, and I think the story that I found most compelling was Michelle's. So let's start right at the beginning. You decided to do something absolutely bonkers and hop in an RV, travel the world during a pandemic, and interviewing everyone you could come across from all walks of life. So take us back to your situation. Where did you even get the inspiration for starting this journey?
Well, so this is the question I asked to everybody in the book, right? Is that right, Chris? It's January 1st, 2020. What was your 2020 supposed to be like, and what did it end up being like through to the present, right? So you want me to do that? Okay. So at the beginning of January, I was loving life. I had just gotten back from Christmas break in the Caribbean, and I had been telling so many people how much I loved my job. It was this great job. I got to travel nationally all the time. I was doing national events at the US Senate, the US House, really important work. And I just kept pinching myself at how wonderful it was. Then on January 17th, I got hit by an unknown virus. And it caused what's called labyrinthitis, which means it hit my 8th cranial nerve, which took out my vestibular system, so I couldn't walk. And it took out my hearing in my right ear. And so I was using a walker for a little bit, and then started to go to therapy so I could walk by myself again. Then I got laid off from my national events and partnerships job from a nonprofit because COVID was coming and we couldn't get on planes and go do that. And I thought, no big deal, I'll get another job. I had been a lawyer in Washington, D.C., an international trade lawyer before kids, and I had always landed on my feet, and I had a lot of good schooling, and I thought, I'll be fine. So in the middle of March, I started sending out cover letters, and by the middle of July, I had sent out 86, and I had no job. And I even offered my services for free as a 57-year-old intern, and people were like, nah, never mind, we don't need you. So on July 15th, I was sitting in a Target parking lot because the lease on the post-divorce house was up on July 31st. And my youngest was going off to college. And because I could not find a job, no matter where I looked, it didn't make any sense to rent an apartment someplace because I didn't know where I was going to have to live. So I sat in that Target parking lot on July 15th and I thought, okay, where are you going to tell the movers to put your stuff when they come on July 31st? I was like, well, the only thing that makes sense is storage. Okay, where are you going to live? In the motorhome. I had a 2006 motorhome because I had homeschooled my kids and I'd road schooled them once for 10 months in caravan with my parents. Hi, Mom. I know she's watching. in Care Bear with my parents, and in Care, we did it once for 10 months and once for 4 months. And so I knew how to do that. I knew how to live in the motorhome. I knew how to get myself all around the country in the motorhome. So I thought, okay, I'm moving to the motorhome. And then I thought, well, what are you going to do? I thought, well, I could take it to the beach. But you can be miserable in paradise. And the thought of going to the beach and trying to pitch my way to a job that still was elusive, I thought, I'll wake up every day terrified. I need to do kind of a run, Forrest, run thing. I need to just get in the motorhome and head west. But I can't just go see national parks, which is what I do with my littles, because I'll cry the whole time because my littles are no longer little and they wouldn't be with me. And then out of the blue, I got this image of Humans of New York by Brandon Stanton, this wonderful project where he photographed thousands of people and listened to their stories and put it up on social media. And then it became a book. I thought, okay, I'll just do a project. I'll have my friend Charlotte White put together a great website, and I'll interview people and I'll get it out on social media. And in December, I'll say to people, look what I can do. Please hire me. So that was the goal. So on September 11th, that was the date, I started driving west in my motorhome towards Yellowstone, because I had been out to Yellowstone so many times, like, I'll just drive you out to Yellowstone. And alongside me was my Shih Tzu buddy. I did not know about John Steinbeck's Travels with Charlie's when I started. When I was partly on my way, people said, oh, you're doing a John Steinbeck Travels with Charlie. And I said, I don't really know what you're talking about. But of course I learned. So I just started heading west. And the idea was to do this project to get a job. And what ended up happening was people said, don't you realize you're recording history when you interview all these people? How can this just be for a job? And I thought, they've got a really good point. Like, this has to be offered up somehow for posterity. And so over Christmas break, I sent an email to UNC Press and I said, is this a book? And they said yes. And so I continued on with my travels to add more and more stories, because it was important to me to have a very broad and deep representation of people in America. So that's my story.
I just driving around the country, I wouldn't know where to even start. I wouldn't even know when to turn left, when to turn right, what country to start at. Like, it's such an undertaking. It's completely fascinating to me. So how did you decide which way to go? How did you decide what people you wanted to talk to? Because you have such a wide range of voices, all different backgrounds, ethnicities, people who are successful doctors, people who are living on the street. You capture America during this time. So how did you find the people that you spoke with?
Well, that was really tricky. And the other night, I'm going to digress for a second, but the other night, UNC Press asked me to write a blog for their blog page. And I didn't know really where to start. And so the first sentence of the first paragraph, the one only sentence of the first paragraph was, I am often very naive.
I mean, yeah.
I mean, yeah. Right?
Yeah.
So I think that was a key ingredient to this whole thing. That was the secret sauce, because I was just like, sure, I'll just get in my motorhome in a pandemic and I'll find lots of people to talk to.
Everyone will want to talk to you right now.
Everybody will want to talk to me, and it'll be easy to find them. So when I got to the first campground in Virginia, I went up to some people in like campers nearby, and asked them if they wanted to talk to me. And they were like, yeah, like lady, I don't know what your problem is. So that was a major crash and burn. And then I thought, okay, this is not really gonna work. What do I do next? And so I thought, okay, I'll send emails to organizations. So I knew I was headed from North Carolina to Yellowstone. And like I said, I had done that trip maybe round trip 6 or 8 times total. So I really knew that route. So I thought, okay, I'll just I'll look at towns I'm going to be at along the way, and I'll send emails out to museums and radio shows and nonprofits and newspapers and say, hey, can I interview somebody from your organization? And so that's how it started. And it was very rough until I got to Pine Bluffs, Wyoming. Now, so I was going to try to interview people in Cheyenne, but in big cities, they tend to be more difficult to get interviews with than in smaller towns. And so I was striking out with Cheyenne, and I saw, well, there's this little town called Pine Bluffs. And I remember I had gone to a conference called Radically Rural before the pandemic, and I was in the journalist track, and they had said Facebook is the town square. It is the new town square of America's towns. And I thought, okay, I'll go on Facebook, see what's going on in Pine Bluffs. And Pine Bluffs had just had this kite festival. I'm like, a kite festival in a pandemic? And so I reached out to the
kite festival in general.
I know, right? Right. Well, that's true too. And so I reached out to the director of the Parks and Rec, and I said, can I interview you? And she said, yeah. So I got there and she said, why do you want to talk to me about a kite festival? And I said, Sonia, you don't understand the people on the East Coast, what they would give for a kite festival at this point. And so we had this great conversation, and then she just really bought into what I was doing, and then introduced me to a bunch of people in the community. So that actually was the path, is figure out, go to the Facebook posts on communities on your travels, find something that's kind of interesting, email ahead of time. And then when you get there, find a connector to help you connect with other people in the community.
And that I'm sure worked for many of the participants that you spoke with. But in the book, you've also spoken to people who live on the streets and people in much different walks of life that you wouldn't find maybe through a Facebook hookup. How did you come across speaking with those people? So
I was raised by a social scientist, my mom, and a rocket scientist, my dad. And they explained, garbage in, garbage out, right? And so I didn't want that scenario. I knew I had to be deliberate about making sure that this was a mosaic. And so I had a grid, an ever evolving grid with density of a city and kind of like rural, suburban, urban, race, gender, ethnicity, LGBTQ, religion, jobs. And so, for example, when I got to LA, on my second trip out west, I did 2 trips out west, but on my second trip out west, and there's a map in the book, when I got to LA, I said to myself, I need to interview a homeless person. So I went to Echo Lake Park and I talked to maybe 10 people. And one of the people's stories, we put them under anonymous, is in the book.
Amazing. I've noticed, obviously there's a sense of people who have lost loved ones, people who have lost their jobs. I noticed that a theme is a lot of people felt that they lost their purpose, their sense of why they're here, what they're doing. I'm a ballet dancer, what am I if I can't dance ballet? I'm a restaurant manager, what am I if I can't serve my customers? Did you find that to be true for most of the people you interviewed, that a purpose was lost?
I think it depended on the part of the country. I think that there were a lot of people, because they lived in open parts of the country, where their lives were able to pretty much continue as they were before the pandemic, because they had open space. For people who were in denser parts of the country, big skyscrapers, big apartment buildings, people who had restaurants, I think it was very hard because the uncertainty was, as an actor in New York City says in the book, us actors are used to uncertainty. The theater community is used to uncertainty, but this was a level of uncertainty like we had never known before. And I think that is a very fair statement to make for a lot of the country. The uncertainty was something that we had never known before. And so when you can't do what it is that you were passionate about doing before the pandemic started, I think is very destabilizing. And but it's interesting because in that void, some people found new things. So there were people who were in sales and would be away from home 3 weeks a month, but now they were home and they rediscovered their families, and that was pretty special. So for example, Jared and Carrie in Henrietta, Oklahoma, they were both oil pipeliners, and they were sometimes away for 6, 8 months a year from their families. And Jared had 3 kids, and so they weren't able to go out and do their jobs in the oil fields because we weren't using much oil. And so they were home, and Jared and Carrie started making cornhole boards and it became an entire business. And they were so busy they couldn't even hang out and play like they thought they were going to be able to do. But the silver lining was that they got to really spend a lot of time with their families. So I think there was a shifting of purpose in some cases. And then there was Anne, who was a wedding planner in Los Angeles, and she couldn't do weddings, and so she still likes to do events. So she ended up doing a lunch every Monday for the outhouse people in her community. And when everything reopened, she said to herself, I don't know if I want to go back to weddings, because what she had done during the pandemic, she regarded as the most important work of her life. So I think it gave some of us an opportunity to do something different, which made us question whether the path we were on before was one that we wanted to stay on for the rest of our lives.
That's
That
why
was
I
a
enjoyed.
long answer. That was a really long answer to that question. I'm sorry.
No, but I like, because there's so much heartbreak, in this book, and obviously throughout the pandemic, that it was nice to come across stories where people found themselves, people rediscovered loved ones, spent time with their families, and that it does draw out some of the, when you're trying to find good in something so terrible. And even it was funny just to see one article about a liquor store owner who was gangbusters. And I know myself, I felt like my wife and I were going to the liquor store so often. I didn't want to see the same clerk behind the counter. I was like, yeah, it's one of those businesses that just really took off. And
Yeah, he said it was like Christmas Eve every day.
oh
He's
my
like,
gosh,
it was crazy.
Yeah, I could only imagine. So it's good to see some of those positive outcomes in such a negative landscape. Now, I noticed.
Although the flip of that, just not to, I'm sorry to cut you off, but the flip of it, Chris, is that Randy in the book has an auto, he's an auto mechanic. He has a store in Arkansas. And on the flip side, he said that he was really worried about people. And the thing that made him start to be worried is because he's the one that does the installations of the DUI monitors on cars. And he said, I'm doing so many of those, I'm starting to worry about people. So that was, kind of the flip side of that. And then the other interesting thing is Tim, the liquor store manager, his wife Jennifer is in the book. They're from Mississippi, and she was a high school teacher, is a high school teacher at a Title I school. And it was really interesting, heartbreaking, but also like gives you pause that when the students didn't have to be in the classroom, a lot of them added more hours at fast food restaurants so that they could help support their families at home. And then Jennifer and other teachers would say to them, what Jennifer said to me is, I'm not going to stop any of our seniors from walking across the graduation stage, which of course didn't happen in 2020 either, but I'm not going to stop any of them from graduating. And the kids would go into the break rooms and try to Zoom into class or, FaceTime into class from their phones. I mean, it just was a time where it was number one chaos, and we were all trying different ways to make things work.
It's crazy to see, comparative to when you think your life is crazy, just being in a room with kids, what other people obviously went throughout this whole thing. It'll bring tears to your eyes. I noticed that you didn't include any photos of any of your people you interviewed. Was there a particular reason for that?
Well, I was planning to right from the beginning. And then what ended up happening, since this is published by an academic press, the book had to be peer reviewed at the beginning, and then the final manuscript had to be peer reviewed. And when we sent the final manuscript out to the peer reviewers, one of them came back and called it elegiac, which means poetic. And I thought, he wouldn't feel that way if there'd been photos. And then I really started to pause and think about it, because a photo kind of stops that process. And it makes you also maybe think, oh, well, this person looks so different from me. Maybe their story isn't as relevant to me. I didn't want, the idea of it being poetic, like tumbling from one story to the next, and you don't know what you're going to get from story to story, right? And it kind of tumbles you through the pandemic. And I think that without people's photos, at least I found some of myself in every single story that I heard from those 300 people I interviewed. And I thought, I want to give everybody else a chance to do that as well. And I didn't want the photos to get in the way.
Yeah, I feel like it definitely lets you create, like if you're reading any book, create your own characters in your head, and that you sort of connects you to that person rather than if you knew, what they look like, maybe there'd be like a disconnect because it's not within your own thoughts and how you relate to them. Of course, like one of the biggest issues over the pandemic was like politics. Did you find traveling the world were people wanting to talk about politics, or did they more gear towards themselves and their personal well-being and their family?
Well, my mom, who's now come up for the third time in this, kept saying to me, Michelle, yeah, hi, Mom, kept saying to me, Michelle, stay away from politics. Michelle, stay away from politics. And I said, Mom, I don't know if that's going to be possible, because we're coming up on the 2020 election. I took off, in the middle of September. And, but fortunately for me, I found the right question. So the question was, as we talked about at the top of this, it's January 1st, 2020. What was your 2020 supposed to be like? And what did it ended up being like through to the present? And what I found is that's the only question I need to ask. People would talk for 30, 35, 40, 45 minutes, practically not even breathing. And when you ask somebody an open-ended question about what's important to them, you're going to focus on their family, their friends, their community, their careers, their hopes, their aspirations. And maybe out of 300 people, 2 people kind of just touched on the political thing for a moment in their interview and then kind of headed out of it. And that was it. Because really what matters to each of us is what's close to us. But I have to say that after a lot of the interviews, people would say to me, can you tell me how other people are doing out there? And then they would say, is it really as bad as the TV makes it out to be? And I said, I'm not actually finding that. And they said, that's what I was hoping. That's what I was thinking. Because and then they would say, I wish we could just get rid of, social media and those TV stations. They're just like setting us up like rock'em sock'em robots and like pitting us against each other and trying to get us to hate each other for profits. And it's wrong. And I heard that all over the country, that people realized they were being used and we were being pitted against each other for corporate profit. So I heard that consistently. So it wasn't in the interviews because it's not what people wanted to answer the question with, but when there was a dialogue afterwards, that's how the dialogue went.
It's traveling during the pandemic is hard to meet people and to chat with them, but I guess in a way, because people are so isolated, people were happy to talk to any other human, and we just got them to talk for 40 minutes straight, which like, thank God I could just speak to a different person. So like maybe that worked out in your favor in a little bit.
I think that's true. I mean, during the pandemic pause, when we were pausing from the blind grind, people were taking more time with each other. I think we were thinking about each other. People often ask me, what is your favorite story? And the favorite story to me is actually one that's not in the book. I was in Texas between Alpine, Texas, and Marfa. And I was a little bit low on the air in my tires. And I saw this pickup truck near the side of the road. And I pulled over and I said, hey, do you know where I can get air in my tires? He said, well, I've got a generator in the back. So as Calvin was filling up the air in my tires, we were talking about what I was doing. And he did the same thing that almost everybody else did, which is, how are people doing out there? Really curious. And then he said, you know, my life's really good down here. And actually things have been great. I've got so much space and my business has been booming. And he said, but I keep thinking about, what about those restaurant owners in New York City? And I said, Calvin, I said, you know, what's really interesting is 3 days ago, I interviewed Dominic, who has a restaurant in Manhattan. And I interviewed Dominic on January 31st, 2021. And I talked to Calvin on like February 2nd or 3rd. And I said, Dominic is not allowed to have people eat in his restaurant and he's getting financially killed. And he's really angry. And then Calvin said, that's what I was afraid of. And he said, could you please tell him that there's a rancher in Texas who's thinking about him? So, you know, I picked up the phone to Dominic, like probably 5 minutes after I left Calvin. I'm like, hey, Dominic, there's a rancher in Texas who's thinking about you. And he said, no way. And I said, yeah. And I said, you know what? I actually think that a lot of us are doing that right now. And I think that's one of the loveliest silver linings of the pandemic, is that we all did think about each other and we all were interested in each other's stories.
Amazing. We're going to open up the Q&A in a few minutes. So if you have any questions, feel free to type into the Q&A icon below. But until that, was there ever a point, this is probably just my intense curiosity on your journey, but was there ever a point during the trip where you thought, like, driving down the highway, this is crazy, like what am I doing? Or once you're in it, you're full steam?
Did I mention that I'm often very naive? No, actually there wasn't. That moment never happened. And I had a confidence in myself, and I had a confidence ahead of time in the people I was going to meet. And really fortunately for me, it worked out that way.
And just going off that, I mean, you've learned so much from other people, what they experienced during the pandemic. Has writing this book, has interviewing these people, has traveling across the country, have you learned anything about yourself in this process?
A lot of things. I'll keep it brief. I think first of all, I learned my gosh, and Mom's gonna say, like, I gave you that book. Yes, I know you told me about the book, Mom. It's a book called Who Moved My Cheese? And in the 90s, I read Who Moved My Cheese. And if you've never read that book, it's an amazing book. It's very short.
You also get 10% off that book.
Yes, that's right, Kay, right? So, but to keep it short, is that what it basically says is there are two mice who go into this maze every day, and they run to the same exact room every day, and there's a piece of cheese waiting for them. One day, though, they run to this maze and the cheese isn't there. Like, oof. Next day, cheese isn't there. Third day, cheese is not there. So Fred, the mouse, says to Joe, you know what, Joe, I don't think the cheese is coming back. I'm going to head out into the maze and I'm going to look around, because I'm sure there's another cheese someplace. It may not be the same cheese. It may not taste the same. I might not like it same. I might like it more. But that's what I'm going to go do. And Joe's like, nah, that's all right, fam. I'm just going to stick here. The cheese is coming back. So I thought a lot about that book, because I was literally going out into the maze, as it were. But I had confidence, frankly, because of that book and life's experiences, that I would find another cheese. And so I think that's one of the things I learned about myself, that I could rely on myself to find another cheese. And that that silly old phrase, when one door closes, another one opens, really is true. I think that the other thing I realized, and I didn't realize it until somebody talked to me, two things. One, a nonprofit director, Rena, in Georgia, said to me along the way, you know, action is the antidote to fear. And I thought, man, she is right. Like, I learned so much from so many people on this trip. And then Romy from New Jersey, who's a yoga instructor, said to me, well, you know, Michelle, whenever there's scarcity, there's also abundance. And so another of my big learnings is whenever you're stuck, whenever there's scarcity, my scarcity was I had no job. There's always an abundance. My abundance was an uncomfortably embarrassing amount of free time. I also had an abundance of experience traveling the motorhome all over the United States and an abundance of curiosity. And so I leaned into that. And it's actually that same scarcity and abundance strategy was what my dad used when he saved the astronauts on Apollo 13. That's a whole nother story. But the scarcity was they didn't have any power and they had something else in abundance. And so my dad and his colleague used those to help save them. So I brought that forward and realized how powerful that whole lesson is.
Oh, that's a fun little fact you dropped on us. Yeah, we'll have to have a whole other. Gotta come up with some more questions for you based on that. So before we open up for questions, is there any final thoughts? Anything you want to add? What would you like people to take away after reading this book? What do you?
So what I'm hoping is that my goal was just to offer up the stories for you all to process as you will, to take what you need, to leave to the side what you don't need. What I'm hearing from book clubs is that it's really a lovely way to sort of process and rethink about and sort of align one's experience during the pandemic. And I'm hoping, this is my biggest hope, is that you feel like when you're reading them that you're riding shotgun with me and that you're there hearing the stories being told as they were told to me for the first time while I was out on the trip. So I hope you feel like you're riding shotgun with me.
I think it's time to open up some questions. We have this is a great question right here. How do you feel this anthology might be different if you had begun the interviews later on in the pandemic?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And so I even felt when I started getting out there in September 2020 that I had missed it. I'm like, darn, I should have started this back in May when we were still in the middle of the pandemic. So naivete again, right? And obviously we were still very much in the midst of it. And that winter was a hard winter. So I think doing it contemporaneously was really good because people were still trying to process their experiences and they felt raw.
We have another really great question here. We all have stories, and pandemic stories are both alike and different in many ways. How did you choose which interviews to include?
So I worked with UNC Press on that because I loved all 300 of the stories that I collected. So I basically got out the grid again, and I said, okay, I need some religion stories, different religions, or not necessarily religion stories, but people from different religions. So I had to fit it into the grid to try to get a good representation, and I left out so many stories I wanted to include.
Going off of that question, I think that's a great question. How did you know during your travels when enough was enough? Like when I've done it? Because I feel like when you're out there, you almost feel like you could just keep going and going and going and collecting and collecting and collecting. Whereas there a point where you're just like, I've seen my grid is full. I've seen the variety, and it's time. It's time to start putting this collection together.
So today is March. This is the way I'm going to answer it. Today is March 13th. And a lot of you may remember Friday, March 13th, 2020, which was the last day of in-person class for most kids in the United States. And I think March 12th was the last day that Broadway had a show, 2020. And to me, in my mind, Broadway closing started this on March 12th. September 2021, I rented an Airbnb in Midtown, and I was there when Broadway reopened. And that was an incredible feeling. I know, full circle. I saw the opening night of Come From Away which is about 9/11, another tragedy. It was, the energy in the audience was just insane. And Ron Wilkins, who is this one of the last stories in the book, he was performing it with the Duke Ellington Orchestra, Birdland, right across from where I was staying, and he had almost died from COVID, and he was a trombonist. And so sort of meeting Ron and having him say, yes, I went from New York to San Antonio and I contracted COVID. I was on a ventilator. They thought I was going to die. And now I'm back here and I'm playing. And now he's playing in the pit at Funny Girl. It's just, it just seemed like the right time, like having Broadway reopen was sort of the marker for me.
That's amazing. My dad's a drummer on Broadway too, so he can like really relate to that. Just yeah, the whole thing shutting down and almost starting off for us too. It was like the NBA season was canceled, and I remember 3 years ago it got real fast.
Yeah.
We have another great question. Have you considered following up with anyone to see how things have changed for them now and what new choices they have made?
Well, I'm in touch with almost all of the 100 people in the book. And we've, in fact, UNC Press has sent out to all of them a hard copy of the book. And so I've been able to stay in touch with them. Yeah, so I know how things are going for most of them. And, you know, for the people who experience loss, including a couple of people that I interviewed, loss is never recovered.
Right.
I don't know how else to say it.
Well, me particularly are amazed by, you know, what you've accomplished, and you've gone out there and met so many people, and the courage you had to do that. And like you say, this is living history. This is something that, you know, could be read, and it's, you know, you can read the stats, you can read the numbers, you can read, but you captured the American soul basically during this time. So thank you so much. I highly recommend picking up a copy. It's fantastic. So with that, I'm gonna bring us back to Kay, if Kay is here. Hi,
Thank you
Kay.
both so much. It's just truly wild that this really is the exact anniversary.
Sorry to interrupt. We
Yeah.
have one more last
Please.
question. I want to get to that before we end.
Absolutely.
Did the Auntie Sewing Squad ever get together?
Oh, that is a really good question. And so the Auntie Sewing Squad, I'm glad. Hopefully there is several aunties out there, and I'm going to try to answer this really quickly. If you want to know what the Auntie Sewing Squad is, I'm going to make this super quick. A woman named Christina Wong, who was an LA comedian who could not perform because of COVID, she started making masks on her Hello Kitty sewing machine. And it ended up growing into this national volunteer organization of aunties, is what they called themselves. Auntie Sewing Squad. They made 350,000 masks for vulnerable communities, and they're still making items for vulnerable communities even now. I saw the other day on Facebook. I don't know if they got together. I can tell you that there's a book about the Auntie Sewing Squad. And Sandra's on here. What is did Sandra? Yes, they got together. Not all of us, but many of us on multiple occasions. Yes, Sandra. So yes, the aunties did get together. And then Christina Wong did a one-woman show off Broadway. I met her when Broadway reopened, and she got a Pulitzer Prize finalist for drama for it. And she just won the Doris Duke $550,000 cash award. And she started the whole thing off as an LA comedian, and she's in the book. Oh, yes. And she's, I guess last night was the closing night in LA, but she'll be doing the show all over the country.
Well, thank you so much, Michelle. And
You're
as you can
welcome.
see in
Thank
the chat, is it listed your coupon code to buy, and like I said, fantastic.
Yeah. Thank you so much for folks attending tonight. Thank you for showing up for a virtual event. Michelle, this is the perfect book and event for us to host on this day, this anniversary. Chris, hearing your story, having you as a moderator, as you were part of the book, is really special. And folks, please buy Who We Are Now, Stories of What Americans Lost and Found During the COVID-19 Pandemic, and support Greenlight Bookstore.
Thank you,
Thank you
Kay.
all.
Thanks, everyone.